Our society is set up to make minorities ashamed of their own identity. The obvious example would be through the way they look. However, something that's neglected is the attack on the way they speak. The myth of white superiority spread throughout many facets of education that preserve a Euro and US-centric view on language must be displaced. This will be completed through minorities telling their own stories in order to deconstruct and replace these racist narratives. Even though young students' work might not be academically up to standard to be published, some type of publishing could be used. Instead of having to go through 4 years of difficult and expensive schooling to feel like their voices are worthy enough to be heard, they can speak now. Many minority students feel as though in the world around them they are constantly being told who they are, and they just feel the need to scream, to stand up for themselves. Schooling systems like LAUSD, UCLA, and the UC system must provide minorities with the opportunity to speak for themselves, to make their voices feel valuable, especially in LA, where minorities find community in such a large metropolitan area. The need to scream. Los Angeles educational institutions empowering minority students. Stefanos Gorlanos' essay titled Polyschematic Prehistory at the Dusk of Colonialism, Internationalism, Racism, and Science in Henry Briel and Jan Smuts discusses how a polyschematic approach to prehistory can be used to reinforce racist ideology and support colonial ideals of a racist hierarchy, and this helps emphasize the importance of literacy. A polyschematic approach to prehistory is the combination of a variation of models and schemata, which have very key differences, but those differences are very often muted in the theory itself. These conglomerations of ideas are so dangerous because even in something that seems as niche as prehistory, changes in the way we view the small subject informs the way we view society as a whole. A perfect example of someone who understood this and used this was Henry Briel while he was studying The White Lady, a cave painting in what is now modern-day Namibia. Briel was using loose logic to make the Bushmen seem too conceptually limited and technologically incapable of making the painting. Therefore, Briel and other prehistorians were perpetuating the ideal of white supremacy to the past so that the idea can be qualified by time to still exist in the present. This helps emphasize that literacy is needed to decipher complex racist narratives. Education is the tool needed to gain this literacy. However, higher education systems like UCLA might be perpetuating these ideals themselves. UCLA has an academic advancement program with a stated mission to make higher education more accessible for underrepresented groups and to develop their skills to be able to transform to society. The issue is these goals sound eerily similar to racist, high-risk programs at predominantly white universities in the 60s. Steve Lamas' study in 2008 explores high-risk programs at primarily white universities, but it heavily focuses specifically on the Education Opportunity Program at the University of Illinois and its respective writing lab. These programs aim to create higher education opportunities for minority and underprivileged students, but ended up establishing a white mainstream standard as superior. Although these programs were seen as initially progressive, underlyingly the structure of the courses made it clear that they weren't trying to help the students become more fitting for minorities, rather the minorities were meant to become more fitting for the system. This effectively pivoted the responsibility of change onto students in the program rather than the oppressive institutions that abided by racist standards. This goes to show that the special opportunity of education was almost essentially reserved for white people. The fact that when non-white students entered these spaces and were forced to conform to white standards for language helps reveal how deep systemic racism is rooted throughout our society. Universities like UCLA are where one must go to gain levels of literacy to decipher works like the previously mentioned Briel. And if racism has its claws sunk into higher education, then there's sparse hope for students who are people of color to learn how to combat it. It's hard to dismantle an ideology that one is forced to conform to and internalize. However, the roots racism has in education go even deeper than just higher education. In fact, it begins at essentially the nucleus of education, which is language learning itself. Long-established myths in the practice of language education have perpetuated racial hierarchies that place white people at the top, and schooling systems in LA like LAUSD are contributing as well. Due to a high population of immigrants throughout Los Angeles, LAUSD has programs like Standard English Learners and various other programs for those who might not have English as their first language. In her 2008 essay titled A Critical Examination of Common Beliefs About Language Teaching, From Research Insights to Professional Engagement, author Ryoko Kubota helps illuminate how beliefs common in teaching English as a foreign language contribute to rigid understanding of the language and the way it's taught. She points out how ideas such as the legitimate language myth, the belief that standardized English is a superior form of language, dismisses the various other styles of English that are effective forms of communication. This myth is very closely tied to the idea of native speakerness, which itself is linked with whiteness. These combined help reinforce this Euro and Eurocentric view that the ideal teachers and learners of the language are white people, which is reflected throughout the structure of the curricula and the preferred demographic when hiring for teachers internationally. These ideas perpetuate the thought of white supremacy in the learning of the language itself. Her work is urging educators and people as a whole to reconstruct their way of thinking, to challenge these racist standards, to make the field fair for everyone, and LAUSD needs to take note. In Are You Going to Show This to White People? Chicana/O and Latina/O, Students' Counter-Narratives on Race, Place, and Representation, author Ramon Antonio Martinez, exhibits that even at a 6th grade level, minority students at an LAUSD school are able to construct counter-narratives against racist ones, which goes to show that all they need is the opportunity to speak for themselves. Martinez interviews many students at a public school in East Los Angeles, and they all lend interesting perspectives on the narratives put on themselves and their community. Firstly, the student Kobe questions Martinez on why he's there, and when he tells the boy he's there to study them, Kobe says, "Ghetto kids, huh? I see how it is." Kobe exhibits a great understanding of the common false tales of Latino communities in LA as gangsters, among other things. Later in the essay, there's a group of girls who collaborate to show how stupid the stereotypes of their community are, and they push the author to show this to white people because they need to hear it. They point out how the media focuses far too much on the negative of their community and neglect the good. These girls exhibit the ability to construct counter-narratives that aim to replace racist stereotypes. Even at what seems like a low level of education, students are willing to fight against racist narratives that work to define them in society. I personally grew up in Los Angeles and didn't participate in LAUSD schooling. However, even without going through the system, it's clear that it needs reform. For example, I just spoke of a study of a public school in East LA, which would mean that it falls under LAUSD. It's notable to say that 98% of the school were Latina/O, and 40% qualified as English learners. Clearly, they're the perfect demographic to express what it's like as a minority whose language skills may be looked down upon. These students didn't feel like they were being properly represented throughout society, and yet it's clear they thought they couldn't do much about it. They knew that their communities were seen as a bunch of dangerous gangsters. At such a young age, they already know that society is trying to tell them they're someone they're not. It just goes to show that not having opportunities for students to use their voice and knowledge to tell their own stories is simply not enough. The students encouraged the author to show his work to white people so that the dominant narratives of their community could be usurped. However, Martinez himself says, "In my efforts to avoid and combat dehumanizing forms of misrepresentation, I had overestimated my own role and underestimated the role of these youth." End quote. To confirm efforts to make minorities ashamed of their communities, they must be provided with chances to take pride in themselves. An institution such as UCLA, as prestigious as it is, does not escape the responsibility of empowering its minority students. UCLA is seen as one of the top universities in the nation, and yet it seems like the school doesn't see its students as worthy enough to speak for themselves. In higher education especially, there's an emphasis on the importance of standard English and the need for high proficiency in it. Regardless of the possible Eurocentric effects of this thinking, there's still another issue. A student putting work into the world and being associated with the university means it'll be held to high standards. This seems to discourage universities from publishing any work they see as not up to a certain academic standard. However, this places a worth on the voices of minorities. If one has to reach a certain level of education just to be recognized as knowledgeable, then higher education would be acting as a toll station on society. Universities, especially those as highly regarded as UCLA, are extremely expensive. Some accepted applicants can't go in the first place without the proper financial aid. Even if a student can pay for 1 year, it doesn't mean they can afford the next. So for underprivileged students, their ability to speak their minds and command respect while doing so boils down to if they're lucky enough to afford it. And the institutions that are meant to enrich their minds have no issue with this. This critique could be expanded to the UC system as a whole. The UC system is highly regarded as possibly the best public university system in the nation. They have multiple schools that are seen as very prestigious, such as UCLA or UC Berkeley. However, any school within the system is seen as a good university. I'm currently a student at UC Santa Cruz and experiencing the system myself. I would argue that its efforts also aren't enough. Throughout all the schools, there is a high population of minority students, and yet they don't have the opportunities to speak for themselves. The system makes an effort to make sure the education it gives its students is racially just and fair. But the extra push to provide their students with platforms to stand upon so that they can give their own authentic stories, to redefine narratives, can make the experience so much more empowering, which can lead to more racial justice throughout our society. Los Angeles can feel like you're living in two different worlds, with one telling the other what it is. If institutions like LAUSD and UCLA take more of an initiative to allow students to speak for themselves, more understanding can be brought. Growing up in LA, I've seen both sides of the city. One is characterized by the ultra-rich and Hollywood, the other is seen as ghetto and dangerous. A factor that makes this misunderstanding only worse is that the wealthier regions have a huge storytelling tool, which is the movie industry. They don't just use this to tell their own story, though. They also tell the predominantly minority, less fortunate people's stories as well. If education establishments across the city, such as LAUSD and UCLA, help the youth of those underprivileged communities tell the stories of the culture they're experts in, then true understanding can be brought. The power to create narratives is continually held in the hands of those that need it the least, especially in Los Angeles. If powerful educational institutions take the proper steps, they can help shift the balance of power towards those who could create the most social justice. If a student could at least feel like their schooling system supports their cause, then that could help them see the value in their own voice, especially for the youth in the city of Los Angeles. They can bring so much change just by using their available literacy skills to tell their own authentic stories, telling the real stories of what their culture and community are like. Educational institutions with massive influence in LA, like LAUSD, UCLA, and even the UC system, can help to empower minority students who historically haven't been supported and only suppressed. It's clear that the whole education system is set up to force minority students to assimilate to white mainstream culture, and although some moves for reparation have been made, they're still not enough. By empowering minority students to use their voice, education systems can transform themselves from barriers to pedestals. Minorities are willing and capable of telling counter-narratives to combat the dominant stereotypes of their communities in our society. This is especially true for the Los Angeles area. Students can break free of the chains put upon them by society with a little support from the institutions that are meant to be preparing them for the world. They can feel like there's some sort of power to make change finally in their hands. I'm not saying that we need to be published in academic journals or in a very formal way. However, if it could only be video essays and other projects posted to a source where it's made clear that the work is made by students honing their skills, it would be a great step forward. Just allowing minority students to use their voice while being backed by their institutions can help bring understanding and racial justice.